My name is Jay Shamba. I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy here at George Washington University, or IIEP as we call it. We here at IIEP are very pleased to be hosting this event on Taking on China, the Imperative and Agenda for India, as part of our series Envisioning India, and to once again be partnering with our co-sponsor, the Seeger Center for Asian Studies at GW. For those who don't know IIEP, we're located at the Elliott School at GW, and we're a cross-school interdisciplinary research center. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality, multidisciplinary, nonpartisan research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization. It's a mandate we interpret rather broadly, so it includes international trade, international development, international finance and macroeconomics, poverty studies, climate change, and economic policy more broadly. And we've had a real focus on China's economy and India's economy over the last number of years. And so this event fits very, very squarely in the research program and set of events that we've held. We've been very busy at IIEP lately, so please take a look at our website for upcoming events or our YouTube channel for prior events, if there are any that you've missed. I'd like to acknowledge the IIEP Executive Circle for their support and welcome any members in attendance as well. And now I'd like to turn things over to Ajay Chibber, a distinguished visiting scholar at IIEP and the organizer of this series, to introduce today's speaker and events. So once again, welcome virtually to Washington, DC, and Ajay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jay. And we've just had a very important meeting in China where the President Xi Jinping has been is set on the stage to becoming president for life. We've also had the first informal summit or virtual summit between President Biden and Xi Jinping after quite a long wait, so to speak. But I think the big question that people should be asking in China, in the Forbidden City at least, is to use an old Chinese joke: who lost India? And the answer is, it was Xi. Just playing on an old joke here, that India and China were not the greatest of friends, but ever since Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China in 1978 and met Deng Xiaoping, there had been this tacit understanding that both China and India would focus on their economic development and leave their border issues in abeyance. But since the arrival of Xi Jinping, I think the belligerence on the Chinese side, despite Prime Minister Modi's best efforts to have informal summits, the last of which was actually in 2019 in Mamallapuram, that has not worked. So, and we now have this great book that we will discuss today by 6 authors, 2 of which Dr. Ganesh Natarajan and Ambassador Gautam Bambawale will be with us. Ambassador Bambawale is not here at the moment, but he will be joining us shortly. He's caught in a traffic jam somewhere. But he has been ambassador to China, to Pakistan, to Bhutan. He's probably served more than a third of his life, according to him, working on China issues. So he's very well qualified to speak on China. Dr. Ganesh Natarajan is, I won't read out his entire CV to you, but I would call him a serial entrepreneur. He has an innovator both in India and in the United States. We have with us also Ambassador Jaimini Bhagwati. Jaimini Bhagwati is risen to great heights in the Indian Foreign Service, including India's ambassador to the EU and the High Commissioner to the UK. But he's also had a great parallel career. Besides being a stellar star of the Indian Foreign Service, he has been an expert on finance, has worked in the World Bank's Treasury Department for many years, and and also in the Ministry of Finance in India. He's the kind of guy you want on your side in a tennis game. You don't want him on the other side of the net. I've known that to my cost many times. We also have with us Manjeet Kripalani. She is the executive founder of one of India's best think tanks on international affairs and international economics in Bombay, called the Gateway House, located very close to the gateway of India. And it's a lovely place. And Manjeet has had a great career before that in journalism as well, which you can read up about. So we have a stellar cast. The book has been written by 6 authors, 2 of whom will be here with us. But the other 4 are also very famous people. Mr. Mashelkar, a scientist, Mr. Kelkar, who was chairman of the Finance Commission and Finance Secretary of India, with Ajit Ranade, who's a very well-known economist in Bombay, and Ajay Shah as well. So we have today this stellar cast to discuss who lost India and how should India respond to China. So over to you first, Ganesh, and then I'll hand the chair back to Jay Shambach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajay, and pleasure for us to be here. And I'm going to give a slightly long introduction to the book. And what I'll do is I will talk about the motivations, what really made us write this initially as a policy paper to be presented to the government. And eventually it turned out to be a full-fledged book. And also I will talk about the various facets of this book, because as all of you can imagine, taking on China as a big neighbor of India is not easy. And we said it's going to need a lot of policy interventions. It's going to need a fair amount of strategic patience, as we called it. This is not going to be an economic battle that's won in a day. And that's why we looked at all the facets of the economy, industry, kept out of the military part of it, but diplomacy, and diplomacy is what my colleague Gautam, when he joins, will talk about. And so essentially I'll cover all those facets, and of course, very happy to answer questions as we go along. But initially, let me lay out the problem. I mean, if you really look at the history and go back maybe 40 years, 1980, China was a 305 billion GDP economy, and India was 189 billion. And if you take it in purchasing power parity, it's almost comparable to each other. Sadly for India, I think if you looked at 2019, which is 2 years ago before COVID hit all of us, China had grown to be a $14 trillion economy, and India was still at 2.9 trillion. In a sense, India was becoming too small to count. And we said that this is a concern for all of us. And as you rightly said, Ajay, I mean, there was a kind of a feeling that, okay, that's fine, but we'll chug along with our economies. China was still the biggest, continues to be the biggest trading partner of India. But then, of course, aggression came in the form of a very hostile attack in the Ladakh region, as you're all aware. India gave a magnificent military response. I mean, due credit to our military, who also gets outnumbered in a large sense by China. But that's when 6 of us sat together, and we're all kind of affiliated with the Pune International Center. And we said, let's start thinking about what does it take in the longer term to counter such things? Because if we didn't do it, we knew that a time would come when the Chinese aircraft carriers would be prowling the Indian Ocean, and we would have very little to argue or say about it. So then we started looking at the research. And just a few data points I want to kind of bring to you. If you look at the period 1978 to 2017, China added 375 million jobs. In fact, China's huge population, as they started becoming more and more of an outsourcing center for manufacturing, really came to the party. In fact, for 6 consecutive years prior to 2019, the country added a net of 13 million jobs every year. In a sense, the story of employment and output growth over a long period is very consistent with what many of you know as the Lewis model of growth, enunciated by Arthur Lewis in 1954. And in this model, the modern urban industrial sector draws upon an unlimited supply of labor from the traditional rural agricultural sector. And this was a model that China really exploited to great effect. So this unlimited supply of labor kept a lid on wage growth because there was hardly any wage growth for a very long time. For the first 30 years of reform, since 1978, their growth in real industrial wages was nearly zero. And of course, there was government subsidies, whereas the growth in real GDP was 10% per year for 20 years. Thus, the spoils of growth, if you look at it, was split very unevenly between labor and capital. Most of the profit embodied in this high GDP was plowed back as reinvested capital, and there was very high investment to GDP ratios. Interestingly, China realized, as many of you know, that they had to move from this very labor-oriented kind of business to new economy. And very wisely, I think China, a few years ago, started rebalancing its economy. And they said, let's move from export orientation to domestic drivers, move away from investment to consumption as the biggest component of the economy, move away from industry as a dominant growth factor towards services, which is what, of course, India has played reasonably well, to move away from old economy, dirty industries like metals, mining, chemicals, to very modern, clean sectors such as renewables, electric vehicles, other green industries, and shifting from what they call the present to the future in terms of enterprise, emphasizing smart manufacturing, IoT, industrialization 4.0, artificial intelligence, space, advanced software, semiconductors, what have you. China also, of course, as many of you would have read, proposed a community for the shared future of mankind, which appears to be an attempt to build a coalition of countries which are kind of disaffected with democracies and the Western model, which I think was hinted even in the discussion with President Biden that Xi Jinping had yesterday. So it is a different model they're trying to propagate. And a lot of the new initiatives in terms of building coalitions around them is oriented towards that. India, of course, on the other hand, I mean, we have had a problem. Even today, hardly 400 million of our 1.3 billion are gainfully employed, and we need to put another 400 million to work. But it is an opportunity. The reason why it's an opportunity is if we really believe that China will fall out of favor and there will be a lot of new jobs or job opportunities available, I think India has the manpower, has the demographic dividend, as we call it, to really participate in that growth. So what we're now seeing is that in such a situation, okay, where there is an opportunity for India as well as a challenge, we have the opportunity to achieve superior GDP growth. And I'll end with that saying that, look, potentially we could grow 8 to 10% for the next 20 to 30 years, whereas China will conceivably fall in growth to maybe 4 to 5 to 6%. And that will actually restore the economic balance. Now, why is that important? If you really look at matching China in the long run, we're really saying that there has been a strong domestic imperative in India to achieve high GDP growth. We need a dynamic economy that creates jobs and prosperity. There's now an additional external imperative that if we don't look strong economically, even on the military sense, I think we may be threatened, as indeed happened in Ladakh not so long ago. And I think the growth slowdown in India, I mean, you could argue, why is India, what used to be called the Hindu rate of growth, 3.5% to 4%. Then, of course, there was a brief period when we grew much faster. And then even pre-COVID, we started coming down. I mean, there is a tendency and there is a belief that the whole administrative processes of the economic management in a very, very democratic setup has not kept pace with the imperatives and the need to make changes. So I think that was one big issue that we all thought. But the fundamental argument we made, and in fact, it's initially a paper we wrote, like a 10,000 word paper, which was presented to all levels of government in India, which was well read. We got some amazing responses from people in power. We also got a very negative response from somebody from China, which is actually one of the consul generals, which is to be expected. But the fact was that, I mean, we kind of got the conviction that we were being heard. So what were we saying? We were saying three things. The first is that demographic factors are in favor of India. And of course, the outlook for the working age population, as I mentioned earlier, is substantially superior to China because they've somewhat flawed one-child policy between 1979 to 2015. I mean, created a premature kind of baby bust, which they're now trying to correct. Indian working age population is expected to peak at about 1.15 billion in 2045. So there's a 25-year period of increases in working age, which we can exploit. We also know that the Indian financial system allocates capital better than the Chinese financial system. I mean, while China has been very heavily built on investments, India has been built on capital inflows into a very, very robust stock market. And I think that's the advantage. We also know that Chinese exports are fragile to the extent that they've been led by state interventions, to, in a sense, shaped by distortions in finance, exchange rates, subsidies, etc., etc. And the exporting that takes place from India is grounded on true competitive advantage. I myself spent 30 years in the IT services industry, and we know the value that people place on Indian resources, both on-site and offshore, and that continues to be there. And we can, as I'll come to in a minute, we can take that into multiple other sectors of the economy. We also believe, and this could be a belief, that in the ultimate analysis, the successful nations of the world are characterized by market-oriented economic policy, which has to be located inside a liberal democracy. While this is true at all levels, I think it's particularly true of a modern dynamic economy that people expect any country to be in the future. We also believe that China's path into the future requires political and economic freedom, which of course is not the prevalent belief in the Xi Jinping administration. Clearly what we are seeing with Jack Ma and their crackdown on EdTech and so many other things. But it's not hard to see the links between the rise of Xi Jinping as a strong leader in China, the decline in Chinese optimism about growth, and the increasing stress that is coming to China. And I think that could be opportunities for us to kind of put to leverage. Finally, I think in the history of global economic growth, we have found that latecomers who can have a good strategy can achieve faster and better, and that's something that we are embarking on. And as I mentioned, if you really look at opportunities, I mean, India has been staying away from RCEP and other trade because we really believe that the dice are kind of stacked against us. But of course, and as my colleague Gautam will talk about RCEP and diplomacy, we have to kind of tread warily in that area. But the most important, and that's the point I want to kind of emphasize over the next 6-7 minutes before I conclude, that we look at economic engagement, okay, with the rest of the world as well as with China. There are 2 or 3 reasons why the disengagement from China economically, which has started in a small sense, needs to be done. And we believe that if you're building a road from a local city like Nagpur to the local city like Nasik, it doesn't matter whether the Chinese invest in it or not. But we believe there are cases for introducing restrictions, especially in companies controlled by the Chinese state. I mean, if you look at a strategic position like the Jawaharlal Nehru Port, or let's say Delhi Airport, none of these we can allow any kind of investment by China. So I think that's something that we're looking at. Second, we believe that there is a need to avoid locking into Chinese controlled technological standards. For instance, 5G, quantum computing, all these are going to be extremely important areas where we cannot allow Chinese participation. We also believe that there is a fair amount of surveillance that happens. So India must police against and block Chinese state surveillance of Indian persons, whether in India or China. And if we take these 3 defensive actions, we also need a very strong innovation policy. I mean, quite honestly, for 20 years, I have been a great fan of China, built very successful Indo-Chinese joint ventures, including a computer training company called Aptech. But we genuinely believe that we lack, or we have kind of lost out in terms of innovation, the quality of research universities that China has built in many senses. And that is something that we really believe that we have to now focus on. Apart from that, let's look at the industry comparison. If you look at the industry comparison, India has nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, the Indian economy has demonstrated stellar growth from 1991 to 2019, 275 billion to 2.9 trillion, as you know. 18 billion to 330 billion US dollars in exports, though of course imports had also accelerated. Foreign exchange, which was less than $1 billion to 425 billion US dollars. And I think most important, research studies have said that India was ranked globally 9th by market capitalization and 5th in nominal GDP. Nothing to be ashamed of, but remember, there are 3 areas which we kind of researched very deeply. And we said that, look, let's look at industry segments where we are hugely dependent on China, and there is a massive asymmetry. And there we must progressively reduce dependence. The second category is what we looked at as a focus on what we in India call Atmanirbhar, or self-dependent, that we're not dependent on imports to grow these industries. And we must, of course, meet all domestic demands. And the third category is where we truly have the opportunity to dominate globally, which is what China has demonstrated in manufacturing. So just to give you a few examples, and I'll just take another maybe 5-6 minutes. If you look at the category 1, which is huge asymmetry areas where India must progressively reduce dependence, one clear thing that stands out is rare earths. I mean, even if you look at lithium ion batteries for EVs, etc., huge amounts of imports from China have to be done. So having a very large availability, natural availability, China has a dominant position. And I think the future game plan for India here must be to make rare earths mining and production, and which is true even for the American economy, more attractive for the private sector, and ensure that this huge dependence on China is reduced or mitigated to whatever extent. Category 2, if you look at opportunities to become self-reliant, what we call Atmanirbhar or self-dependent, or Atmavishwas, which is self-confidence, and meet domestic demand, telecom is one clear area. Because if you look at the global market for telecom, 2019 was 1.7 trillion US dollars, and India's revenues in this sector stood at 96 billion, while China's mobile ecosystem was 750 billion, and then added just to the Chinese economy. So China's success in deregulation, which is very evident in this area, has led to mega companies like China Mobile, China Tower, China Telecom, China Unicorn, Huawei, ZTE. So all these are mega corporations, and they've done extremely well in telecom. However, if you look at India, I mean, we, especially with companies like Reliance Jio, which has kind of raised huge amounts of money, I think the whole area of participation of internal participation in 5G, and looking at preform optical fiber, there's quite a few fiber products that are happening in this country. We believe that this is one area where within the next 3 to 4 years, we can certainly be self-dependent. So I think that's something that's important. And if you look at the really interesting areas where India can truly become market leaders, which is what we believe, the first is consumer electronics. I mean, clearly India is a huge market. I mean, India and China probably are the biggest mobile internet users in the world today. And we are expecting that the global consumer electronics industry itself will be about 838 billion US dollars. So I think that's a big opportunity. And China, of course, is a dominant factor there. A lot of the critics of the Indian software sector says that, look, by creating a kind of protection where we could import equipment at will, it kind of dissuaded India from getting into hardware, fab, semiconductor manufacturing. This needs to be addressed. I mean, I won't get technical, but there is something called the core ICT layer. Okay, the ICT layer is where you actually design components, manufacture, and then put software on them. India is very much played in software. And we believe there is a $1 trillion opportunity for us to participate along with China and Taiwan and Thailand and a few others in the core ICT layer of semiconductors and electronics. So that's one clear area. Second area, of course, is automobiles. And as many of you would know, in the auto component sector, India has done pretty well. And I think that's an opportunity for us to leverage. We also believe with the future of automobiles very much in the electric, autonomous, connected vehicles, huge amounts of electronics that go into every car. India's proven competence in technology combined with the auto sector can make us very successful in that segment. The third area is chemicals. I mean, as many of you know, China has multiple chemical parks, dedicated parks, and they've done extremely well in that area. But India does have opportunities, especially because of the China +1 that many global companies are looking for, many customers, to provide a real alternative destination. We've been talking to the government. I mean, Industry 4.0, smart production systems, really automating the whole chemical production process is one area. Similarly, in pharma, as many of you know, both our vaccines are doing pretty well, Covaxin and Covishield. And the pharma industry is very excited about continuing to be dominant, not only in vaccine production. There is a downside to that many of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, continue to be imported from China. And there is what is called a productivity linked incentive scheme that the government is doing to make that happen. And finally, and I'll stop with that, agriculture, where India unfortunately has been hampered by our agriculture being very focused on rice and paddy, as we call it, wheat. But now there is an opportunity to produce cash crops and do much more, both in self-reliance on agriculture, which we have, plus making it an export economy. So essentially, what are we saying? We're saying that, look, there is a huge gap at this point of time. There is an opportunity with strategic patience to bridge that gap, not tomorrow, not in the next 5 years, but over a 15 to 20 year. It needs patience. It needs investment. It needs identifying champion sectors, champion companies. And it also needs, I think, the collective will of people, the corporate sector, civil society, and the government to make that happen. So, but the core focus of our book is it can be done and will be done. There is some external work involved, which my colleague Gautam will talk about when he's here, about in terms of diplomacy. But broadly, we end with a note of confidence that it can and will be done. So thank you, Ajay, and back to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that terrific tour of the topic and the book. And what we'd like to do now is turn to our two discussants to react broadly to those comments, but more broadly to the topic and the book as well. And so I believe we'll start off with Dr. Bhagwati. The floor is yours.
Okay, can everybody hear me? I just unmuted myself. Well, first, let me congratulate the authors of the book. I think it's a very, very timely book, given all that has been happening on India-China relations for quite some time now. When I say quite some time, I remember listening to Xi Jinping in Delhi in a smallish group. He had come to Delhi in 2014 for the first time. And even then I noted, I turned around to some of my friends after the talk was over, that there was a underlying tone of considerable condescension. And to some extent it is justified, given, as Dr. Natarajan has pointed out in his remarks, the considerable difference in the achievements of the two countries, albeit the systems are very different. I have jotted down a few points so that I don't forget what I wanted to say. There is this statement in the book, which I think is very important, which says that you cannot put the political and diplomatic and border issues in one airtight compartment from the economic issues. I think Dr. Natarajan mentioned that for our generics, which are obviously used in India, generic pharmaceutical products, not just in India, but we are also a significant exporter of those pharmaceutical products. The active ingredients come from China to a great extent. So there is this feeling that we need to put these two aspects of our relations with China into, some people feel, in two watertight, airtight compartments. But unfortunately, when China says that all of Arunachal Pradesh is southern Tibet, and I noticed Gautam has joined, he is far more knowledgeable about China and Indo-Chinese relations. But I think the book is spot on when it says it is going to be difficult, if not impossible, to keep the economic technical exchanges with India, including foreign direct investment and so on, not just trade, technological exchanges in terms of borrowings and so on between financial institutions, completely segregated from what is happening on the border or what China is projecting right now for a variety of its own reasons. One aspect which I don't think I saw sufficiently reflected in the book, I remember a remark from an economist called Pranab Bardhan, so I'm going to take his word for it, at a symposium in Delhi, where he suggested, based on his own research, that by somewhere around the time that Mao passed away, which I think was in 1976, when I joined government, I don't think that there was any correlation between those two events. China had already reached levels in terms of primary education and primary health, in terms of being able to spread it wide enough amongst its population, irrespective of income groups. What India is at today, somewhere around, of course, this discussion was somewhere around 2019 or so. So there is what, almost a 25 plus 20, 45-year gap in, and you cannot, with due respect to the authors, you cannot achieve several of the objectives that the book sets out that India should aim for without substantially higher levels of the average person's familiarity with the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, as they say, and some basic assurance about health. Of course, this government and past governments have been talking about it, and some progress has been made. I feel that a substantial amount of the government's efforts should be directed towards providing a stable way in which people can access education at the primary level and health without spending too much time and a significant amount of their savings on either. Now, this is very easily said rather than done. In communist China, you probably get shot if you don't go to teach. Here, we are fully familiar with absentee teachers and health centers which don't quite function the way they should. So I would say that along with the other recommendations made in this book about rising to the challenge that China poses for us, we need to be very careful and progress much faster. Speech is easy, talk is cheap. We have heard this again and again, but I feel more needs to be done. On trade and investment, as Ajay mentioned, I'm also a finance guy, besides being a diplomat, sometimes going and working in the Department of Atomic Energy with Dr. Raja Ramanna, who is a famous man because he was at the helm of affairs when we did our first so-called peaceful nuclear explosion. Putting on my finance hat, I think our real effective exchange rate of the Indian rupees, at least compared to 2004, 2005, and I've written papers on this. And, you know, I think knowledgeable observers can have a slightly different point of view about it. But I think most of my friends within the circle of economists and finance experts would agree with the fact that the rupee is overvalued. The extent, I would say it's as much as 25%. So if you were to talk to an exporter today who has not branched out into some other areas which he or she could easily branch out into because they produce good X, but Y is sufficiently correlated in terms of the expertise that is required at both management and technical, and the kind of infrastructure that they already possess within their factories and so on, they don't branch out or they don't increase production because they're not. But if you tell them that the rupee is 10% lower in value, and here I'm not talking in abstract, this is with regard to conversations with actual owners of companies in India. I'm not in a position to reveal their identities because they themselves might be a little skittish about my talking about it openly because those are private conversations. 10% reduction in the value of the rupee vis-a-vis the world's international reserve currency, which is the US dollar, would make some of their exports internationally competitive. And I am positing that the rupee is at least 25% overvalued. And here, there's a related issue which comes up now and then in India, and the Chinese experimented, which is the extent to which the capital account is convertible. I would again suggest that now is not the time to think of greater capital account convertibility for India. As you know, the Chinese tried it a couple of years back, and whoosh, about $1 trillion worth of wealth left China because people want to hedge against country risk. In India, they hedge it by buying gold. So India has perhaps in private hands the greatest or the highest amount of stocks of gold. And that is a way of hedging against what I would suggest is country risk. You're scared about what happens if the economic management, political management of the country goes south. You have gold, which is, you cannot in India, for those who are based in the US, go to a bank, give Indian rupees and demand US dollars. You'll have to explain what you need it for. Do you need it for a child's education in the US, or you need to travel, or whatever it is? You cannot sell your house and then go to and take the rupees and demand foreign exchange because our capital account is not convertible. So there, I would submit caution should be the byword, and we need to be careful taking into account the experience internationally. Now, coming to large companies in China and some of their vulnerabilities, which perhaps does not get reflected in a book as much, because ultimately, you can only write so much. Otherwise, you'll be writing volumes which are much thicker. I'm just mentioning this for the audience. That is, while China has achieved a lot, and I would again say health and education are two important things, and I'll come in a minute on education. One little thing about language. They've also done it on the back of a lot of debt. And everybody has heard of Evergrande, but my sense is that there are other companies. I think I noted this down from somewhere, Kaisa or something. So there are many companies which are called state-owned enterprises, which are perhaps over-leveraged. And some of what I'm seeing Mr. Xi Jinping doing is because of concern about their own. There are internal issues in China which are getting reflected in their foreign policy, including its flexing of muscles with India at the border. My sense is that the middle class in China has grown to such an extent and has got used. It's like feeding the beast. That middle class, which is where a lot of churning happens, has grown to an extent that it is difficult for the Chinese leadership to keep meeting their expectations of rising per capita income and higher standards of living, because they've already reached a certain level. And as was mentioned by Dr. Natarajan, exports are not the only way that China can grow any longer, because they're already at some very high level. So to that extent, the leadership perhaps is already reading between the lines. How do we meet these expectations? At the same time, address these issues of many companies, many SOEs, state-owned enterprises being over-leveraged. So we need to somehow divert attention with some jingoistic moves, whether it is with regard to, I'm not suggesting that that's the only reason. I'm saying that that is one of the several reasons that Xi Jinping has been a little adventurous outside, and is also, let's forget about all this stuff about how their diplomats have become far more frank as compared to the past. That is not the important thing. What they say is not important, what they do on the ground. So whether it is some villages that they have populated on the border, somewhere in Arunachal Pradesh, people are differing within India, whether that is within the territory of India or not. Again, without getting into those details, some of these moves of China of sort of beating themselves on the chest and saying, like good old Tarzan, that I'm the big guy over here, is actually directed at their internal audience. Because we have to remember that China of today is not the China of even 10 years ago. I'm told from various studies that quite a few Chinese are now going back after studying in the US, given the fact that while the per capita incomes are very different, it is not as different as it is for India. So now they have the experience of using, whether it is Google or whatever. As we all know, you don't have access to that in China. Now, how do you bottle up the natural human tendency to want to be as free as possible? My sense is that all human beings want to prosper and they want to be free, not just to think, but also speak and write. So to that extent, a lot of what is happening today is my guess, and Gautam will speak to it. I'm giving my 2 pennies bit about when you want to rise to China's challenge. I think for the foreseeable future, by foreseeable future, I mean 10 years. Even that is not foreseeable, but let's say that that is foreseeable. I expect China to continue to do this strongman thing with its neighbors. It's also kind of signaling to India that, you can't run and hide behind the apron of the US. You need to deal with us. You have a long border with us. And it's also a signal to ASEAN and others to behave themselves, because they depend upon their economic linkages with the US. While they are neighbors of China, several of them have land borders with China. So you better understand that you better behave yourself. So as I said, some of this is towards the neighbors, but quite a bit of the signal is to their own domestic audience. let me see, what else did I want to say with regard to the book? Yes, one aspect on the foreign relations side in the book, when you want to rise to China's challenge, is the fact that Russia is a very large supplier of fossil fuels to China. Now, that creates dependence as far as Russia is concerned on China. China can buy fossil fuels from other places as well. But as we know now, there are direct supply lines and so on. And to the extent that both of us, I mean, both India and China have bought the S-400 missile defense systems from Russia, which means that Russia is one leg up, even compared to China, despite all the rhetoric about how advanced China is technically, but they obviously found that they cannot produce a missile defense system of the sophistication of the S-400. Since I was responsible at the joint secretary level with regard to Russia, let me tell you that Russia is way ahead of China as far as the defense industry is concerned. Way behind in many ways, but they have some of the finest institutions within, obviously, the government sector. Now, they produce that stuff at high cost because they have traditionally not understood how to keep costs under check because, you know, government monopoly. But in terms of technology and in terms of our traditional relationship with that country, and for good or for bad, we have, I think it's come down to about 60% of our defense equipment is with Russia. So there is dependence on Russia till such time as we diversify and produce more of our defense equipment ourselves. So we need to also be mindful of how do we play it out with Russia. As you know, the Russian NSA came to Delhi for the meeting with which our national security advisor had called, while the Chinese and Pakistanis did not come, as can be expected. So somehow Russia should also be on our radar when we think of rising to China's challenge, not just on the political defense side, but also on the economic side. Russia has a relatively small population of only about 150 million people for a country which is many times the size of India as far as its geographical expanse is concerned. And I'm talking about Russia, not about USSR. What else? You know, as far as rising, and I'll stop, I think I've already used up quite a bit of my time. We need to be also mindful of the fact that we need a two-language formula. I'm talking to you all in English, and all of us can understand each other, and many, many Indians who are not participating today would also understand the language. They may not want to be or can be part of this discussion today. So there is this mistaken belief in some quarters that you only need to learn Hindi and your regional language. If you're in Tamil Nadu, I think that would be a mistake. Forget the political aspects of it. Forget the fact that this will get, some people will get emotionally charged and come out onto the streets and demonstrate and set fire to government property. I think going forward, let's forget the three-language formula. That may or may not work. We need to focus on just your regional language in English. You can talk to everybody in your part of the country, and you can talk to people in other parts of the country in English, and you can also talk to our friends in the United States in English, be it with certain accents and be it with limited ability. But that mistake, I think some people in government make every now and then, both in our state governments. And a related subject here is the growing disparity in rates of growth between the North and South, the growing disparities in the rates of growth of population in the North and the South. So as and when delimitation for our parliamentary constituency happens, I hope they keep on using the 1971 census for a long time, because otherwise you're going to have further divide between North and South India, because South India is progressing much faster than North India. So we need to be mindful of that today. The problem will happen tomorrow, but we need to focus on it today. If you're going to rise to China's challenge, at least within India, you should not have those kinds of what used to be, that word was Vis-A-Vis. And I'm sure people in the US would be surprised. What is this Vis-A-Vis? We are very, very conscious of the fact that we have what? I mean, please correct me. We may have 12 or even 14 scripts. Most people in Europe felt that they have as many languages as India. Yes, but they only have 4 scripts. We have different scripts. So, this is a marvel that India has been one country for so long. And people outside India, and people even within India, those who are stuck in their little places and are not reading enough and are not sufficiently aware that this is one of the marvels of the 20th and now 21st century that India has held together. So if you are going to rise to any challenge, including that of China, I would suggest that we need to be very careful, and I will not go further down this line of what is happening socially, etc. Let us be one country, let us embrace each other, both physically and otherwise. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to meet the expectations that we have of ourselves, that I'm going to use a politically charged word, that the free world expects of us, and we expect of ourselves. We'd be very far from challenging China in any way if we don't set our own house in order. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much for those comments. I gather that now Ambassador Bambawale is here, and so we'd like to turn it back over to him before turning to our second discussant. So Mr. Ambassador, if you want to take the floor now, we'd love to hear your comments on the book and the topic more broadly.
Sure. Thank you so much. Let me start by saying that it's such a great pleasure to be on this webinar with GW University. Apologies for being late. It was due to traffic that I couldn't make it back to my hotel room in Bengaluru, in Bangalore. But let me dive straight into the subject itself. When the Chinese began the military operations that they did in eastern Ladakh in northern India, roughly at the end of April 2020, and it became public knowledge at the start of May 2020, all of us in India who had some experience and knowledge of the terrain, the military kind of relationship between India and China, understood that this was a different kind of operation. And the reason for that was because the Chinese had moved at least 50 to 60,000 troops, along with heavy weaponry, artillery, tanks, to this theater. So it was different from earlier situations that we had faced, say in 2013 at a place called Depsang, also in eastern Ladakh, and later in 2014 at a place called Chumar, which is also part of eastern Ladakh. In those instances, it was small numbers of troops, of patrols, which came face to face with each other. And then there was a bit of a standoff, which was then resolved over a period of weeks. This time round, we realized very early that this is a totally different kettle of fish. And many of us realized that, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, had not moved these troops only to withdraw them a few weeks later or a few months later. And today, a year and a half later, we can see this, and especially after the last round of military talks between the Indian and Chinese military commanders, there has been a very strong statements from both sides by both governments. So this shows that what they began in April or May of 2020, about a year and a half ago, was something quite different from what we had experienced earlier on the India-China border. Now, the immediate question that all of us started thinking and researching and talking about, and Dr. Ganesh Natarajan would have mentioned to you that there was this group of 6 who eventually became the authors of this book, where we started discussing with each other as far back as June of 2020 and then beyond. We began discussing the implications of the military move by the Chinese government, by the Chinese PLA. And as many of you have already read and heard, this was something which was totally different. What the Chinese were trying to do was they were trying to move their ground positions right up till their claim lines, to right up till the line which they claimed as their boundary with India, their line of actual control with India. And this was something which was quite new. Now, from a strategic perspective, of course, what the Chinese were signaling was the fact that they were the rising power in Asia. They were the hegemon in Asia. They were numero uno in Asia. And the rest of Asia, particularly India in this case, should understand this and should fall into line. We, of course, reacted with bringing in as many troops as the Chinese had done. And of course, the fact is that there are certain patrolling routes in Eastern Ladakh and certain patrolling points which we used to use and which we used to patrol it in the past, which we are no longer able to do as a result of these military moves by the Chinese. So that is the situation on the ground. Now, when we started thinking about what India should be doing in rising to this challenge, the immediate answer, of course, is to move your military forces, and which we have done. And I think the Indian military has responded magnificently to the task which was set out for them and which was given to them as a result of this Chinese aggressiveness, Chinese military actions. But in the longer term perspective, we realized that one of the necessary conditions for the Chinese to be able to take this kind of military action, which they have done, was this huge rising and gaping asymmetry between India and China. This is mainly an economic asymmetry, which can be measured by the GDPs of the two countries. $3 trillion on the Indian side, almost $15 trillion in China. So a 5x kind of difference between the two countries. But what is even more important is that this economic asymmetry is also reflected in other aspects. For example, in terms of military preparedness, in terms of military capabilities, in terms of military armaments, etc. It's also reflected in technological prowess. And therefore, the book argues that in the long term, if India has to rise to the China challenge, we can only do so by reducing this asymmetry. And reducing this asymmetry can happen only if India, over the next 15 or 20 years, grows at a higher rate, a higher GDP growth rate per annum as compared to China. Then you will narrow the gap a little bit. And that will, of course, change the situation on the ground, including the possibility of military action. But all that is in the long run. And I think Dr. Natarajan would have covered our suggestions about how India can do this, the catching up that is required. But that's in the long run. What does India need to do in the short run to protect its territorial integrity? And there, what we have suggested in the book is that India needs to strengthen its partnerships with a whole set of countries across the globe. India needs to build coalitions with other countries in the world. And the Quad is an example of one such coalition. There can be other coalitions also. The book also says that there are 3 groups of countries with which India must look at building these coalitions or building these strategic partnerships and beyond. The first group, of course, is the major democracies of the world. That includes not just the United States, UK, there's Australia, there's Japan, there's France, there's Germany, but also with countries like South Korea, etc. The second group of countries with which India should look to build such coalitions are those which neighbor China, which are on China's periphery. And Ambassador Bhagwati mentioned Russia. I completely agree with that. Russia is one of those countries in the second group, as is Vietnam. So these are two other examples which we give in the book. And the third group of countries with which India should build much stronger ties and build coalitions is to strengthen our own position, is of course those which are on India's periphery, which is Bangladesh, Bhutan, the Maldives, etc. So this is, in short, the prescription that we have given from a politico-military point of view, a Paul Mill point of view. That's how India can rise to the China challenge in the short run. But in the longer run, of course, India will have to beef up its economic strength, and from economic strength will flow, technological prowess, etc., which I think Dr. Natarajan would have already touched upon. One last point which I'll make, and I'll stop after that, is that there's a lot of talk in India about strategic autonomy, about non-alignment. Well, I think, the Chinese military pressure on our borders has already compromised our strategic autonomy. And if we are to stave off this kind of military coercion that India is facing from China, the way to go is to build these coalitions with other groups of countries, at least in the short run, so that we can then focus on our own economic growth and strength in the long run. I'll stop there and hand the floor back to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was amazing coordination with your fellow speaker, despite the fact that you didn't have the opportunity to see his comments. You didn't actually overlap at all, which is quite amazing. So I'd like to turn it over now to our second discussant, to Manjeet Kripalani, to offer her thoughts.
Hi, can you hear me? Great. Well, thank you. This is a real privilege to be the last, because I get to have the benefit of everybody's comments. So I think first, congratulations on the book. I don't think there's a single thing that I disagree with. I mean, everything is there. It's comprehensive. A few observations that I would like to make. First, one that is very dear to my heart, since I work at a think tank, and we're all here products of think tanks and universities, that Chinese universities are ahead of India, and the book makes a recommendation that we really need to build up and beef up our intellectual capacity. And I'm going to give you just one comparison point to show how China is ahead. So the Chinese think tanks like CAS, okay, it's Chinese Institute of Social Sciences. It is 124 institutes, 5 universities, 12 management systems. It has a budget of, endless. It has a budget of $15 billion a year. It is the world's largest research institutions, and they have 60,000 researchers. I mean, this is bigger than the government, than our foreign ministry and anybody's foreign ministry. And China has, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of diplomats. We were in Tibet in 2018, and Gautam was our ambassador in Beijing. We came to see him that time. And Tibet alone, they have a foreign ministry office with 90 foreign service officers in Tibet. So, China has used its numbers very well and educated its people and put them out there, and they're all fighting the same fight that Xi Jinping is fighting. So we really have to beef up our intellectual capacity. I don't know if there's a quicker way of doing it instead of building on old institutions. There's a lot of work, for instance, being given to the Indian Institutes of Technology, and they're really good, but they're still very small. And what we are seeing just now, the good news is there is a blossoming of private universities in India, and we see it particularly in North India around Delhi. We see it in the Mumbai-Pune belt, and Gautam is part of one of those, and we're affiliated with one of those. And it's really fantastic because A, it means that a lot of our children don't have to travel overseas to study, because many of them are going to China, Russia, etc. They don't have to do that because they can now stay at home. The beautiful campuses, particularly India's middle class, they have a sense of what they deserve, and like the middle class anywhere else, they're kind of spoiled, and they really should have it. They should have the best. What we need to do, as the book rightly recommends, is attract our own teachers back, and then we have to do something that that China did very well. So China lost, India has a lot of middle management. We never lost our elite. We never lost our educated. I mean, they just became very anglicized, but we never lost them. China lost during the Cultural Revolution, etc. It lost its elite, its educated, and the middle management. So what they did was they imported a lot of the expertise from the West. So the British wrote their laws, the Americans wrote their laws, everybody was there helping China build itself. And then the US helped China get into the WTO. So 2001, the US went out of its way to help and handhold China to get into the WTO, which China did really well. They took everything they could get and worked it in their favor. So consequently, what has happened, the West is completely embedded in China. China is their child. And they feel really sad to see the way China is behaving. And yet they cannot extract themselves away from it. And I remember Nanda Nilikani telling me many, many years ago that the US and China are in a deadly embrace with each other. And even now you can see they just cannot extract themselves. So the China admires the US has this strange relationship with China, and we don't know how they're going to get out of it, but we can certainly get out of it. And thanks to the pandemic, and then to the invasion into our borders in Ladakh and Galwan, we have the ability now to separate ourselves from China. So actually India is in a very good place. So 2000, the two points of the years is the year 2000 and 20 years later, India came into its own with the Y2K, where we all thought the computers of the world were going to collapse in 1999 as it turned into the century. And thanks to Indian software writers, we didn't collapse. And so that brought about the rise of India through its technology and software industries. 20 years later, we have another great opportunity. We've kind of slid back. We've made lots of progress on our democracy, lots and lots. The media says something else, but actually if you go into inner India, which many of us have, you see there's a real strengthening of democracy, a tremendous amount of confidence in people, and especially with the youth who now have more than 5 years education than they had 10 years ago. And it comes out in a very strange way. It's a kind of, they all want to speak English. Jaimini, to your point, they all want to speak English. It's kind of broken English, but it's Indian English. It's what it is. And they've managed to communicate. And what technology has done for them, with everybody now having this great phone, technology has enabled people to communicate in a remarkable way through symbols. You don't necessarily have to have it. And I don't know, Ganesh will remember this. Do you remember that there was a small handheld computer that was created in Bangalore somewhere around 2000 or 2001? It was called the Simputer. And it was supposed to be used by farmers. It created a language of symbols. And it was supposed to be used by the farmers who couldn't, read what was on the fertilizer bags, etc., etc. But that has now become ubiquitous. And India is now the world's second largest digitized citizenry in the world. That counts for something. So we are now at this point where this book couldn't have been better timing. You've come out 20 years later, where we are now ready to make that giant leap forward. So on the book, we need to do everything that the book says. And also India has capacity, I think now, to start doing things simultaneously. We don't have any help, but we should seek the help. So not only should we be buying arms from the US and Russia, which we are, and Israel, we need to get them to help us to build our capacity. We have very, very limited negotiating skills. We can't get into trade agreements because we haven't been taught how to negotiate. We've got people like Gautam and Jaimini that are sitting across a room of 200 lawyers and negotiating at a tough, in a very tough position. All we can really do is be defensive and then just make sure that we're protected. But we need to negotiate well. And all of you will remember the American book called Getting to Yes. It was all about negotiations. So this is where the United States can come and help us against, first, negotiate with itself. We cannot be negotiating with trade in an unequal manner. So we have to learn how to negotiate. We need those skills. We also need to start importing intellectual capacity. We need to build our think tanks, but we need to import teachers also from the US, from the rest of Asia. We need lots and lots of them. And this is what Indian private universities can do. In the year 2021, when we've got Galwan, where as the book very nicely says, not just less China, but China less. We have climate change. We've signed the agreement. We don't have to repeat China's manufacturing model. We really have to take a new model. We have to take the new green technology, and we've already done some of that. Industry 4.0, there is the World Economic Forum has something called the Lighthouse Network, and those are companies, manufacturing companies that have really done very well and digitized their operations. So China, of course, has 16 of them, and the West has most, but India had one, and that was Tata Steel in Kalinganagar, which is in a tribal belt in Odisha. Now, 2 years ago, we were one, now we are 3, and by next year, we're going to be 8 companies on the Lighthouse list talking about digital manufacturing. And the way India has done it is not the way other companies have. India has taken existing companies and made them digitized. And part of it is India's great way, it's a dirty word now, it's called jugaad, but we don't use jugaad, but we really know how to make the most of very little. And we can tweak things very well. So I remember at Business Week, we had a title of story we did on India, and India was on a quest for the best at the very least cost. And our Exim Bank also has that term, they call it AAA. It's affordable, it's adaptable, and it's accessible. That exactly is what India's digitization is doing. And I think the book has mentioned some of it, but we have not talked about how India has created the global digital public goods. So China has copied the Western model. China just wants to be more America than America. But we've created a completely new model of digital public goods. And this is where anybody can get onto this digital platform called India Stack. It's an architecture. And you mentioned, of course, some of this in the book, but it is absolutely remarkable. And people don't talk about it. But what has happened with the digital public goods is what has led to the IPO boom of this last month. Galwan led to the IPO boom of this last month. And Gautam, you will remember that we did a big study on Chinese investments in India. And we pointed out, part of our Gateway House work, that there was a gap between the venture funding. Indian startups were just not getting enough money, and partly because Indian companies do not invest in Indian startups. So apart from Ratan Tata and maybe Mohandas Pai and a few others, they were putting in venture money into Indian startups, but really a lot of it was American money. And through the American firms like Sequoia, they were stopping over in India and getting Ant Financial to invest, Chinese venture companies or Chinese companies to invest in Indian startups. And the amount of money they needed was just between $50 and $100 million. That's where China was coming in. And it was really hard for us to, I remember going to, when demonetization happened, Paytm became the big discovery, right? And China sent, they have an office out in Bombay, in Bandra Kurla complex. It doesn't even have a nameplate on the door. It's just this office. And China had sent 5 members of the Chinese parliament to see what Paytm had done. And PTM is now going to go public. It's valued at $2.5 billion, just that IPO offering. And Ant Financial will get out. But the government put in, we found out that 18 out of 30 unicorns were funded with Chinese money. And the Indian government came out with Press Note 3 and said, we could not have that because that was strategic. And it really was. And we also discovered that the Chinese apps were really getting their high valuation. TikTok was getting its high valuation because of the diversity of India, that it was able to mine all this data. And they were hoping for $150 billion IPO in New York with 40% of their market in India. And we really blew a hole in their sky. So it's not that we can't take on China. India has the ability, and we showed by the banning of the apps and by Press Note 3 that India can act an asymmetric warfare. And that's what we did with China. So I'm going to stop here. There's lots of stuff to discuss in the book, but really that's what I wanted to say. The book has brought this all out, but we can do a lot more, and we're creative. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And really thank you to all the speakers. I want to make sure the audience knows there's a Q&A function that you can enter questions into. And as a moderator, I'll be monitoring that and bring those questions forward to the group. I want to start off with a question that really is to anyone, but perhaps Ganesh, it would make sense to turn to you first, which is, for many of the things that you've discussed, or all of you have raised, how much of it is that China is a necessary motivation, and how many of these are things that India should just do because they're good things to do? And I raise that because that's certainly something that crops up in US debates around whether it's innovation policy or education policy. And when I look at your list, some things are highly specific to China, but many, especially around innovation and building up universities and better education and healthcare and things like that, those seem like things that don't require an exterior challenge. They're things that maybe just need to be done. And so is this that in some cases, China's just a good motivation to do things you should be doing anyway? And how much of it is they're really necessary because of China?
That's a great question. And my quick response is, a combination of what I think Manjeet and Ambassador Bhagwati said. Ambassador Bhagwati actually talked about the need to skill Indians better. Absolutely. In fact, many of us are very, very engaged in that task. And the point that Manjeet made, in terms of this whole concept called Jugaad, which is, do less with less. I think we need to do more with less. We are obviously a country with limited resources, but I think as a compulsion for ourselves, and I did mention it in the opening remarks, that we need to put 400 million more young people to work. And if we don't do that, we're getting all kinds of civil unrest and everything else, and that's going to be there. So we have to do it. We have to do it at scale, which is where the skills come in. We have to do it with very high quality, which is where research comes in. And we have to do it with genuine innovation. Not trying to make do somewhere, but make it happen. And as you rightly said, I think the Chinese aggression was a call to action, because we suddenly realized how exposed we were. That I have friends in China, Chinese friends, and for them, India does not matter. We get obsessed with China, but China has grown to a level where I think India is no longer relevant to them. And except for, of course, teaching India a lesson, which is what I think Gautam and Ambassador Bhagwati talked about. So we need to grow in our own right. We need to grow for the sake of our people. And if Chinese aggression becomes a motivator to do it in a very systematic and a very organized fashion, so be it. But I certainly think your point is right. We need to do it.
Any of the other speakers want to hop in there, or I can keep running through questions?
I think if I may take 1 minute, I think your point is very well taken. Many of the things that we need to do even whether the Chinese had behaved in the way it did in Ladakh a year ago or not. There is a basic problem as far as China is concerned. It goes back to the 50s. At that time, I think Chinese leadership was very envious of the kind of publicity and the kind of coverage that someone like Prime Minister Nehru, they saw India as not just a junior partner, if at all you could call it that. They have a problem being a totalitarian regime and we being a democracy, and in some form or shape, the West might look pityingly at us that, you know, we haven't got our act together on the economic side, but there is a meeting of mind in terms of the kind of discussions we have, and the fact that we don't have any problem with Google or Facebook. It's a different matter how much you want to use, but we're not worried or scared about the West. So here, your point is so relevant that the competition or the engagement with China has to continue in a way which is irrespective of that. I'm not phrasing this well, in the sense that there are so many things we need to do irrespective of what China is up to. Yes, we have to rise to China. We have to rise to so many challenges on our own, irrespective of what China does or what any other neighbor does or does not do. I just wanted to re-emphasize what you said for the record.
There's another question from the audience that I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on, which is, how does India's federal nature and the substantial policy actions at the state level beyond the national level, how does that either aid or complicate the challenge as you see it? Does it make it harder to sometimes push forward in one direction, or does it provide more opportunities? Yes, please.
I know Ganesh is going to say something, but the problem with our Indian states is that, you know, because of our centralization model, they're still children. They're unwilling to let go, you know, from the mother that is constantly providing them with food. And none of them really spend a lot of time raising their own funds. Cities don't raise their own funds. So some states are starting to do it, but until they have learned the pain of raising their own revenues and keeping that money to spend and running their own budgets instead of just being irresponsible, I think that federalism is going to be really, really hard. Some states like the southern states, I think, do a little bit better. They're a little more responsive, but I think that is an issue, and federalism really is economic.
Any other speakers on the challenges the federal nature can raise, the power of the states?
See, let me weigh in on the other side, because I really think there is a value to federalism so long as it's collaborative. The problem sometimes we have is that we get too divisive in the whole approach, and, you know, everybody's blaming everybody else. But as a structure, it works well. And I think what Manjeet talked about, I mean, the 4 southern states doing extremely well. I mean, they've had GDP growths in excess of China, and we kind of get weighed down by some of the other states. And they've grown because they had no aspirations to rule the country. And many of the states were very happy with making sure their states, the people were successful, educated, etc. I mean, Kerala, Tamil Nadu is a classic case in point. And I think that's been the advantage. But I mean, a large bunch of the northern states have exhibited the behavior that Manjeet talked about. And I think hopefully it gets corrected over a period of time. But I mean, I love India. I love the fact that we are a liberal and sometimes vociferous democracy. But I think there's no other way we would like it. And I think we have to make it work.
If I may add, this is a very, very difficult situation we are in. I personally am quite concerned, not so much on the economic side, because there is enough economic exchange. There are economic exchanges across states. You know, workers from the less developed parts of the country go to the more developed parts, and they get jobs at lower levels because they're not that educated. But I referred very briefly to delimitation exercise. For those who are not familiar with that exercise in India, it depends on the census. And I'm personally quite concerned because, you know, the number of members of parliament in the lower house, which determines who is going to form the government in Delhi, depends on the number of MPs or members of parliament that you get elected from that party. Now, each state, and the UP has the largest number of members of parliament in the lower house of our parliament. So without taking too much time, because we are straying too far from the book and the discussion, is the fact that the census on which this is being done is a very old census. And if you do a new census, you will find that the population in the northern states, particularly Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, has grown at a much faster rate. So they will end up, if they were to do a delimitation purely based on population, with more members in the lower house, to that extent, a greater ability to form government in Delhi, even though in terms of development, they lag the southern states quite a bit. I mean, this has not been said too loudly because then you don't want to create further divisions and anxiety. And this also then is correlated with issues of language. Some people in North India somehow seem to feel that everybody should learn Hindi. I don't see that. I speak Hindi fluently, but that's because I've grown up in Delhi, but I'm not from North India. So some of these issues, Mr. Shambhav, you have raised this very pertinent issue because we are quite unique. I mentioned that we have, I don't know, 14 scripts. You name me one country which has 14 scripts. Scripts, mind you, not languages. Forget the fact that, you know, within UP, you go from East UP to West UP, people will not understand each other because that's more a question of dialects within Hindi. So let us not underestimate the divisions and distractions that are caused by the fact that while we all speak in the same way and shake our heads when we say, shake our heads sideways when we mean yes, but that's all good for movies and the comic aspects of some movies. But there are huge differences in the way we think, etc. It's a fact that we also think in terms of one India. But people in power, and I am treading on sensitive areas now, in Delhi need to understand that do not try to force state. And by the way, Manjeet, I'm not quite sure about the irresponsibility of states. Depends upon which state. And states now spend far more than the center. And as somebody who I know in the finance ministry mentioned, he's the finance secretary now, he mentioned that, you know, most of the development work has to be done by the states. Most projects, that any large project will have to be in one state or the other. The center only, even in Delhi, there is a Delhi government. Now, this is to introduce to the US audience, not the people in this panel, those who I cannot see are perhaps watching or listening. There are 36 participants, it says over here, that this is a very difficult kind of situation that we have, which is almost impossible for non-Indians to understand just how different we are in terms of, it is a marvel of the leaders at the time of independence that they were able to cobble together a country, incidentally, which never existed in this form or shape ever in history. You can look back to Ashoka and some people will say, oh, Akhand Bharat, we had this great country which was from Kandahar to whatever. Not really. You think of communications in 300 BC, you know, how many months will it take you to go from Kandahar to Orissa or Kandahar or to Orissa? So, you know, the fact that we exist as a country in the form and shape itself is a miracle, and we need to build on that, not harp on differences. And I think the external world sometimes doesn't quite understand because they meet. By the way, I feel, and one political analyst mentioned this the other day, that English newspapers and English radio and TV channels are accessed by 0.2% of our population. I turned to him for the Indians in this group, that is Prashant Kishore. I don't think he minds if I reveal, because I'm part of a group with him, which is called India Deserves Better. But having said that, that 0.2% is the people, Mr. Shambhav, that you are interacting with. And within that 0.2%, perhaps 0.1% of that. So do not judge India by the people you interact with, because there are vast numbers of people, a huge proportion of our people who you cannot interact because of the language barrier. So we need to promote that. We need to have literally a common language that we can speak to each other in, and for good or for bad, for mostly for good, because we can also talk to you in that language. It is English. But the moment you say that, you'll be accused by some people as being this elitist person who went to an English medium school at college. So we are getting this debate also going on right now between elitism for those who are Indians in the group, the Lutyens, Delhi crowd, and so on. But I'll stop. I think I've spoken enough to this issue.
I'd love to turn to Ajay Chibber for a question now. And I think this may be our last question, given that we're running over on.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to go back and ask both Dr. Natarajan and Ambassador Bambawale, who know so much about China. My impression of China is that there is, of course, this sort of monolithic communist party, but there is intense competition within China. Competitive, what we call competitive federalism. And it exists also not just at the provincial level, but also much below that as well, much deeper. And so how is that? And so we have had some of it in India, but not enough of that. And of course, India is much less decentralized than China is. China spends more than 50% of its expenditure is done not at even at the provincial level, but at the local level. So how do you see, given your knowledge of China, how do you see that for India?
I'll let you go first, Gautam.
Okay. I think that's a very relevant and interesting question, Professor Chibber. But what I'd like to say on this particular aspect is that there is very little doubt that when the policy of economic reform and opening up started in end of 1978, the whole, the logic behind it was to decentralize economic decision-making and take it down from the central government level down to the provinces and even beyond, as you rightly pointed out. And that resulted in huge economic growth, 10% per annum every year over a 40-year period. And China has become what it is as an economic entity. But under the leadership of the current leader, Mr. Xi Jinping, there is a re-centralization of not just political power, but also economic decision-making. This can be seen not only in the kind of focus which is being placed on public sector undertakings, on the state-owned enterprises, etc., but also in the moves that have been made in the past few months against companies like Jack Ma's, Alibaba, and Financial, and much beyond that. So I think that is the name of the game, and I wonder where that will take China, whether it will actually help in increasing GDP growth rates or stabilize GDP growth rates at 5%, 5.5%, 6%, or whether it will bring those growth rates down. In our book, for the use of our book, what we have projected is that China will continue to grow at the rate it is growing right now, which is roughly 5.5% per annum. We are not predicting that China will suddenly slow down. If it suddenly slows down, of course, India's India's job will be easier. But if it continues to grow at 5.5% as we have projected, which I think is a realistic projection, it will mean that there's a lot of catching up to do. So let me stop there and hand over to Ganesh for his comments.
Yeah, so just to continue on that track, I mean, our own calculation shows, and this is of course the power of compounding, as we call it. So, I mean, if you look at China growing at 5% and India growing at 8%, by the time India is 100 years old as a democracy or as a republic in 2047, I mean, the Chinese GDP would be 86 trillion and India's would be 64 trillion. So again, back to what it was in 1980, very comparable. But to your point, Ajay, is a very interesting point. I mean, my own experience of China, having been there at least about 40, 50 times over the last 30 years, is that it's very, and you said it right, I mean, it's very decentralized in the sense the mayors of cities. I mean, for instance, the mayor of a city like Tianjin, which is not even Beijing or Shenzhen or Shanghai, has invested more in artificial intelligence for the city than the whole country of India has done.
Right.
So they have tremendous capability to take their own decisions, of course, within the ambit of the Communist Party, without a doubt. But I think that's interesting to see that model and the way they're able to. I mean, the mayor of Shanghai is probably one of the most important people in the entire Chinese country. And I think, but the flip side of that is in India, because of the nature of democracy, things that are of value to states, to the country, to citizens get adopted very, very quickly. I mean, to give you one example, I mean, going back to what Manjeet mentioned about this whole area of Aadhaar, or what you know call the India stack. I mean, many of you would know this. I mean, there's something called the JAM Trinity, which is Jan Dhan, which is a huge financial inclusion that the country did. There is Aadhaar, which is a unique identity system where almost every Indian today is covered with a unique identity. And mobility, and mobile phones, of course, has totally exploded across the country. So this JAM, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and mobility created the inclusion that we are seeing with India Stack. And what is India Stack at the end of the day? I mean, it's the payments ecosystem. This company called Paytm that I think Manjeet kind of alluded to, and as she said, it's Ant Financials funded. But the amount of payment apps, the amount of payment ecosystems that are coming up is all created by that. And our own, in fact, I'm right now working on another book for the Pune International Center with Ijaz Ghani, who many of you know, who's formerly of the World Bank, lives in Washington, DC. And Ijaz and I are researching on this one, and we're saying that, look, like the India stack in financial services, I mean, you would have India stacks emerging in agriculture, in employment, in small and medium enterprises, in skills. And they'll transform the country. And this will be democratically adopted. I mean, because it's there and people see the value. And that is, I think, the beauty of, as I said, progress within a very, very democratic environment. So I think the outcomes are similar. I mean, the Chinese mayors do great work, get support from the political party. In India, it may be an idea that is floated anywhere, but it gets very quickly adopted if people feel, even state governments feel, it works for their citizens. So I think that's the difference in the model. And as Gautam rightly pointed out, even if China settles at 5% and we are able, like next year, I mean, the likelihood that, I mean, maybe we will still grow at maybe 6 to 8%, but we need to get to that 8 to 9% consistently for a 20, 30-year period. That's what China did. 20 years of 10% growth made the difference. And that can be done. That's what I was saying earlier. And I'll conclude with that.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. This was a fascinating conversation. I think we've just run past our time, so we'll stop there. Thank the audience for your questions. And again, most of all, thank you to the authors of the book and to our discussants. This was really, really an interesting conversation. So thanks, everyone. Good evening or good morning.